everyone, my name is Paul and I recently took this scooter for a ride off-road. And it did great, but there's definitely room for improvement. Now, what can you do to a Chinese scooter to make it better off-road? Well, I already have really good tires and there's not much you can do with the suspension. Now the biggest problem I've seen is the position that you sit on the scooter. See, you're supposed to be seated, but if you stand, the hovering above the toilet position really isn't that good for off-road. Ideally, I would have my feet back here, and this scooter used to have passenger foot pegs, but I removed them because when I would put my foot down, it would cut the back of my leg. So I'm just going to start working on it and see what I come up with. Chinese scooter plastic gets brittle with age, so duct tape holds the panels together better than screws sometimes. And you thought it was only for taping ducts together. The leg shield fairing has 6 Phillips head screws holding it onto the front fairing. There should be a couple more screws at the bottom of the panel. Remove 2 large Phillips head screws from the chrome trim. 1 more big screw holds the front panel on. Use a 10mm socket to remove 3 bolts from the front fender. The Eagle's eyes have lights, so I'll need to unplug them. Pro tip, pulling back the right side panel will give you access to the spark plug. The plastic floor has 4 more bolts holding it down. Now I can remove the leg shield fairing. 2 more bolts hold on the lower dirt catcher. It's full of dirt. Let's remove the battery from the scooter now. The seat compartment is held in by 2 nuts and 2 bolts. The grab handles and rear rack need to come off next. The bolts are different lengths, so keep track of them. I'm disconnecting the seat latch cable, then unplugging the rear light connectors. Finally, remove the 2 bolts at the back of the fender and the entire rear plastic will come off the scooter. 3 more bolts hold the inner fender. This part is very important because it keeps dirt and water off your engine. And this is what a scooter looks like with no body panels. The CDI, starter solenoid, wiring harness, and exhaust are on the right side. The air filter, transmission, and fuel pump are on the left side. The gas tank is in the floor of the scooter. The voltage regulator, horn, and turn signal flasher are up front. My plan is to take the gas tank out of the floor so I can't puncture it if I hit rocks. I'm unplugging the fuel level sender and removing 4 bolts that hold the gas tank. That was pretty easy. Use a 12mm wrench to loosen the nut that holds the throttle cable. Pull it out of the bracket, then disconnect the cable from the carburetor. I'll need to loosen the hose clamp that holds the air intake tube. 2 more bolts hold the air box above the transmission. The rear brake cable nut takes a 14mm wrench. With the nut all the way off, I can pull the brake cable out. This little bracket holds the cable above the transmission. It's time to disconnect some wiring. The engine and wiring harness are grounded to the frame here. I'm cutting a few more zip ties and pulling this mess of wires off the frame. The fuel pump is vacuum operated and pulls gas up from the gas tank to the carburetor. This is the ignition coil. The rear shock is attached to the frame with 1 bolt. A long bolt holds the engine onto the frame and acts as the main pivot for the rear suspension. Now there is nothing holding the engine on, but the carburetor is still in the way. And that's it, the engine is out. Okay, this is the fun part. I'm cutting the gas tank mounting brackets off the frame with a Sawzall. This is where Chinese scooters really shine. I bought this scooter for $100, so I really don't care if I mess it up. I can do whatever dumb modifications I want without worrying. There was a lot of shit welded to the frame here, and I removed all of it. I got this small piece of sheet metal from Home Depot. The plan is just to have a metal floor instead of all the plastic. The 4 slots cut into the metal are for zip ties. I left the center stand on the scooter because it acts as a skid plate and protects the engine from rocks. I added a second piece of sheet metal here to fill in that space. 2 triangular pieces of metal will fill in the front section of the frame. With a nice weld holding the bottom edge, I can give it the right amount of curve with my sledgehammer. I'm not really an expert at welding, so I can just cheat and make my welds look better by smoothing them out with a sandpaper flapper wheel. I bought some cheap dirt bike foot pegs on Amazon and I want to attach them back here. The idea is to weld a bracket and a nut to the frame so I can bolt the foot pegs on. Okay, now for a spray painting time lapse. Feel free to hate on my painting technique. I never claimed to be good at painting stuff. And this is my modified frame. I used Rust-Oleum hammered black for the paint. I'll be using a different gas tank that doesn't have a fuel level sender, so I removed the fuel gauge. In a way, I'm making my scooter worse. The battery gauge is useless. Your charging system either works or it doesn't, and having a gauge for it doesn't change anything. I picked up some 11-inch wide skateboard grip tape also on Amazon. This will hide the uneven paint on my floor very nicely. The wiring harness runs along the right side of the scooter under the floor. I left slots in the floor for zip ties to hold the wiring harness. The harness is tucked up as high as possible so I can't get hit by rocks. The throttle cable and brake cable run along the left side of the frame. Now the engine can go back in. Insert the long through bolt from the left side and wiggle the engine to help it find the hole. Chinese scooters have a tendency to fall apart, so adding Loctite to all the important bolts is a good idea. The rear shock is the only other thing holding the engine. Add some Loctite to this bolt too, so it doesn't vibrate off later. The engine and wiring harness are grounded to the frame here. The engine ground cable connects to the upper valve cover bolt. The CDI is held onto the frame by this shitty piece of rubber. Another shitty piece of rubber is supposed to hold the starter solenoid. I taped the CDI, starter solenoid, and wiring harness onto the scooter. I connected both positive wires to one battery terminal to make the scooter easier to work on. And this is what we have so far. The starter power wire is held on with a Phillips head bolt. I shortened the stator wiring to make the scooter less messy. The yellow, white, and green wires charge the battery, and the blue and red wires tell the CDI when to fire the spark plug. The coil is held on by an M5 by 0.8mm bolt and mounts back here. The engine pivots up and down, so make sure to leave plenty of slack in the spark plug wire. The brake cable is next. Install the return spring, then tighten the adjuster nut. Adjust the brake tight enough so you can't pull the lever all the way to the handlebar. The brake pads will make a little bit of noise, but the wheel should still spin easily. The brake cable is held onto the transmission with this little bracket. The fuel hose between the fuel filter and carburetor is 3/16 inch inside diameter, and it's 1/4 inch inside diameter going to the fuel shutoff valve and to the gas tank. I plugged the vacuum port on the intake manifold that was for the fuel pump. There will be only one vacuum hose going to the side of the carburetor. Tighten the two nuts holding the intake manifold, and don't forget to plug in the idle enricher. The throttle cable is next. Hook the cable end into the pulley first, then install the cable into the bracket. Adjust the cable so the throttle snaps shut and has a little bit of play. Tighten the nut with a 12mm wrench. I wanted to use a foam pod filter, but it didn't fit. The stock intake is better anyway because it's actually easier to install, makes the engine quieter, and does a really good job of keeping dirt and water out of the carburetor. PCV stands for positive crankcase ventilation. The PCV hose takes vapors from the crankcase and feeds them back into the airbox. I trimmed the inner fender to leave access for my new fuel tank bolts. I left the front part of it the same because it prevents the tire from throwing dirt and water all over the engine. I welded 3 new mounting brackets to the frame to hold the rear body plastic. I won't be installing the lower floor plastic, so this piece needed a little extra support. Don't forget the 2 mounting bolts at the rear bumper. The taillight bullet connectors were annoying, and one of them broke, so I replaced them with the fuel level sender connector. These 2 connectors are easier to deal with. The fuel tank brackets go on next. The round red brackets came with the gas tank. Can you guess what kind of gas tank I ordered for my scooter? You don't need to fast forward, you'll see it now. This is a 2-gallon aluminum gas tank. It comes with a gas cap and a threaded hole at the bottom. It does not have a place for the fuel sender or baffles to keep the gas from sloshing around. You can get those features, but I didn't want to spend more than $100. I ran a 1/4 inch fuel hose to the fuel shutoff valve. Because the new gas tank is higher than the carburetor, I don't need a fuel pump. The rear grab handles go back on next. I used these handles to move the scooter and to put it on the center stand. The seat latch is held on by 2 bolts. Remember to bend the tab down to keep the cable from popping out. Before we put everything back together, let's hook up the battery and test the scooter. This gas tank is easier to reach and easier to fill than the old one. Okay, it runs and doesn't leak gas. That's great. The seat compartment is ready to go back in. It's held in place by 2 nuts and 2 bolts. These covers are broken. That's okay, I can add some tape. I soldered the fuse wire onto the positive terminal, so now I don't have to juggle 3 wires while connecting the battery. 2 more nuts hold the seat on, and that's it for the back of the scooter. I added a second bracket to the bottom of the leg shield fairing to hold it onto the frame. The front fairing is held onto the frame with 1 bolt, then a bunch of screws hold the 2 fairings together. I'll reinforce the edges with duct tape. The chrome trim also holds things together. If you have this same scooter, install the fender before you install the front plastic. It's easier than doing it after, like I did. And finally, I'm installing my dirt bike foot pegs right back here. Okay, all done. And this is my new off-road scooter. Now the big question is it better or is it perhaps worse than it was before? Let's start with the gas tank. The old gas tank was 1.5 gallons right here in the floor. The new gas tank is 2 gallons and it's up here. It's easier to fill and it holds more gas, but it's heavy. It moved the balance of the scooter back and it moved the center of gravity up, which is worse for handling. Also, I lost my fuel gauge, but if you're at least a little bit smart, you can figure out if you have gas or not without a gauge. The floor is now 2 inches lower and 7 inches narrower without the plastic. And I now have access to the valve cover, the spark plug, and the cooling fan without taking anything apart. I put my fancy new foot pegs in the wrong place. I miscalculated how thick she is back here, and I can't fully put my feet on the pegs. I need to move them 3 inches forward. The center stand clunks against the transmission when the suspension moves up and down. I need to find a fix for this, or unbolt the center stand and put the side stand back on. So, what do you guys think? Did I make this scooter better, or was this a stupid project? Leave a comment below. Thanks for watching, and remember to check out my other scooter repair videos.